On February 20th, 2000 at SuperBrawl, Scott Hall took part in his final match for WCW. He lost a triple threat match for the world title, getting pinned by the champion Sid Vicious. The next time he would be seen by a national television audience would be almost 2 years to the day, when he returned to WWE at No Way Out with Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan. Many fans know that in the time between, Scott Hall would appear for ECW. But how did this come about? How did it end? And what was reported about it at the time? In this video, we'll take a closer look at Scott Hall's time in ECW. But first, we'll look at why he left WCW to begin with. In the days after SuperBrawl, it seemed that things weren't looking good for Scott Hall. In his match, he would suffer a severe sounding injury, made worse by a guitar shot from Jeff Jarrett and a powerbomb from Sid. According to the Pro Wrestling Torch the week after the event, he says he felt a numbness in his arm late in the match, which grew intense after the guitar shot and powerbomb. He lay in the ring for about 30 minutes after the conclusion of the pay-per-view, and was stretchered from the ring and taken to a local hospital. The report goes on to say that he spent 2 days incapacitated. The early prognosis was a swollen spinal cord, which was treated with steroids to help reduce this. I did tell you it sounded gruesome. Although this sounds like a terrible injury, it may have in a way saved him his job for at least a while. Hall was already on thin ice with WCW, potentially about to be suspended or even fired after the pay-per-view. This would be for his actions in both Europe and in Philadelphia, and even his closest friends in the company after last week were saying that he really had to be fired. This is in reference to a 3-show tour in Germany, which took place a week before SuperBrawl, on which Hall would cause problems outside the arenas. The Observer reported at the time that there were incidents every night at bars regarding Hall challenging people to fights, and even throwing cake at his girlfriend and moaning to many wrestlers about the last breakup of his marriage. The report also claims that Scott nearly wasn't allowed onto his flight back to the US, and as a result, he would miss the February 14th Nitro in Uniondale, New York, just days before he was set to main event at the pay-per-view. In the 2007 RF video interview, Scott notes that the girlfriend Dave referred to is the niece of Brad Siegel, who was the president of Turner Entertainment at the time. In this interview, Scott explains what happened in his own words.
And Emily and I had kind of decided that we were not going to see each other anymore or whatever, and so I was talking to this other girl, and the girl wanted to give me a gift. Anyway, this chick wanted to give it to me, but she wanted to give it to me in front of everybody in the bar. She was embarrassed. So, and Emily used her authority as a WCW representative to get a key to my room and come in my room unauthorized. So then she came in. I'm there with the girl. Nothing's going on. The girl's handing me a gift, but Emily blows up, and a food fight ensues, and I'm drunk and. So by the time, and we're up all night, now we got to go to the airport and fly out. When you're on an international flight, you can't be real loud and stuff in the airport, because in Germany, the guys walk around with machine guns in the airport, security. So there's bickering and loud talk going on between Emily and I, and they wouldn't let me on the plane. So I just went back to the hotel and flew home the next day or whatever, but that was the start of the end for me at WCW.
At the Thunder taping on the following night in Philadelphia, there were more problems with Hall. Initially, it was reported that there was some sort of delay while filming an in-ring segment, where Hall was supposed to break a guitar over Jeff Jarrett's head, but instead was threatening to hit Terry Taylor, who was openly not a fan of Scott. Hall told people backstage that he was going to accidentally hit Taylor. When J.J. Dillon got word of Hall's words, he confronted Hall. Hall said he was joking. Dillon didn't buy it and sent Hall home. This apparently caused a delay in the taping, as officials scrambled to decide what to do in place of the segment. Eventually, Bill Bush made the call that they weren't going to allow Hall to do the promo due to his condition, and he left the building with Evan Courageous, and there were rumours going around that this would be the final straw. Whether Scott was going to be fired after SuperBrawl, we'll never really know due to his injury, and this would result in much speculation over how injured Scott actually was. Some thought WCW planned to suspend Hall without pay or fire him. Hall was well aware of that. because Hall knew he might have run out of slack when it comes to his insubordination. Some think he devised an elaborate scheme to claim to have a back injury, so he could stay on payroll and not work. He has had friends who have had injuries, so he would know exactly what symptoms to claim he had. What follows next is several months of contradictory reporting from both the Torch and the Observer. In May, Wade Keller would seem to tire of it, saying, "The story on Scott Hall's condition, lifestyle, marital status, and timeline on returning to WCW TV changes every week or so. The latest expectations are that he will return to WCW TV within a month or so, but that could change 6 times this month." Now normally when I make these timeline videos, I like to tell you about every instance that I can find of that person's name showing up in the newsletters. But if I did that in this case, we'd be here for hours, because there are so many times where they report that Scott might be returning and it just doesn't happen. So instead, I'm going to give you some of the highlights. On April 10th, which is the day of the famous Nitro Reset episode, Eric Bischoff did an interview with Alex Marvez for WrestlingObserver.com, where he said it was all in the hands of Brad Siegel. In response to a different question about the Nitro Reset, Eric said that WCW wouldn't be able to take its product to the level that WWF did, because they can't do anything to embarrass Ted Turner or Terry McGurk. While he was referring to the content of the TV shows compared to the Attitude Era WWE product, you could see how the company could easily apply this logic to Hall too, when he was fit and ready. The Torch notes that Eric told the same thing to talent at Nitro that night, but many weren't sure what to make of it. Some of the wrestlers suggested Bischoff fire Hall, but Bischoff told them it's in the hands of Siegel. Some were skeptical, assuming Bischoff was trying to pass the buck rather than address the problem. Also in April, it's worth noting that the Torch reported that Hall was doing much better in his time away, but this was still met with some doubts. Everybody is saying Hall has gotten his life in better shape now than any time over the past couple of years, but people also claim that Bischoff had changed and matured, but he has yet to show that to anyone backstage. Around this time, on an almost weekly basis, people expected Hall to be back at the tapings, but this would never be the case. Eventually though, references to Scott began creeping back onto WCW broadcasts, and it would seem like his return could have been imminent. On the June 14th episode of Thunder, Kevin Nash made a phone call to his old friend. With Jeff Jarrett bound and tied up, don't ask. Nash phoned Hall, whose voice was supposed to be audible to the viewers but wasn't. According to the Observer, when it came time to do the skit and they called Hall's home, he wasn't there, so they had to do the angle where they pretended Hall was there. This doesn't at all sound like a good sign. On July 9th, WCW presented Bash at the Beach from Daytona Beach, Florida. While this night is largely known for the Russo shoot promo on Hulk Hogan, it also hosted a match between a heel Bill Goldberg and Kevin Nash, where the contract of Scott Hall was on the line. If Nash won, he was able to bring his friend back, but this wouldn't end up being the case. Kevin Nash would end up losing the match when he would be turned on by Scott Steiner, allowing Goldberg to win and rip up Scott's contract. In 2007, in the interview I mentioned earlier, Scott Hall claimed to be completely unaware of any of this storyline playing out on TV, saying that he never watched the show, even when he was on it. This storyline turned out to be a case of art imitating life in a way, as the Torch would report that Goldberg was loudly opposed to Hall coming back. In the RF video shoot, Hall expresses that he doesn't know why Goldberg doesn't like him. But Bill said in his autobiography titled I'm Next, published later in 2000, "It takes every bit of my professional courtesy to hold back my anger toward him, just in the way he carried himself. I never thought he was a good representative for the business. I didn't like the way he treated people. He was arrogant and rude. The fact that he was a heel at the time just gave him an excuse to be a dick." To be a little more specific, remember the time that Goldberg went off script and punched through a car window? According to the Torch, Goldberg blamed Hall for that, as he had angered Bill by making him look bad in promos. There's also that little incident with a cattle prod and Goldberg's streak ending. That might have played a part too. Remember how in April, Eric Bischoff said it was up to Brad Siegel whether Hall came back or not? Well, on July 10th, it was reported that Brad doesn't want him to return, despite them already starting and possibly ending the storyline to bring him back. If this is true, and after watching Nitro this week, it's impossible to believe it is, since they pushed Hall so hard. It either means that the previous statement is a major work, or WCW is really even more incompetent a promotion than it seemed to be up to this point. I wouldn't normally include a quote like this, but WCW 2000 is full of stories similar. In the September 25th edition of Figure 4 Weekly, Brian Alvarez reported that Scott Hall was rumoured to have been given permission to return, and he was due to appear at Nitro that night from the Nassau Coliseum. While this wouldn't happen, Hall would make one more appearance in WCW. Sort of. 1 week later, on the October 2nd Nitro, the main event would be contested for the world title in the dreaded San Francisco 49ers match between Jeff Jarrett and Booker T. The winner, and the champion of the world mind, would be the man who retrieved the title belt from one of 4 boxers suspended in the corners. That's right, pole matches. Early in the match, Booker T would reach for one of the boxers and pull out, instead of the world title, a framed photograph of Scott Hall. Forget SuperBrawl, this is technically Scott Hall's last appearance in WCW. On October 16th, 2000, first reported in the October 21st Torch, Scott Hall would be served his release from World Championship Wrestling. Much like with his injury, a lot was made of the timing of the firing for a few different reasons that we're going to get into now. Firstly, a week earlier, Juventud Guerrera had been let go as a result of a public drug-fueled outburst on a recent tour of Australia. A situation not unlike Hall's. Juvi was threatening to sue for discrimination, since Hall was at the time still employed, and the two instances bore enough similarities. WCW may have been sensitive to the possibility that Juventud would claim he was treated differently because of his national origin. One source close to Hall considers the termination papers coming a week after Juventud was fired quite a coincidence. An alternative theory about why Hall was released when he was relates to a long-standing lawsuit that had only just been resolved in recent weeks. The lawsuit had been ongoing since 1996, when Scott Hall and Kevin Nash arrived in the company and were heavily implied to be invaders from the WWF. Had the case gone to court, WCW management believed Hall could have been a valuable witness on their side, and a damaging witness if not on their side. The risk of letting him go was considered greater than continuing to pay him, even if he wasn't productive. With this now resolved, there was no reason for WCW management to keep Hall on side. A third potential reason that Scott was let go at this time could simply have been financial. On October 20th, just 4 days after Hall's firing, Bret Hart was released from his contract. Bret, who had been inactive since the start of the year following that Goldberg kick and a few more matches, had only made sporadic appearances throughout the year, perhaps most infamously at New Blood Rising, as an attempt to endorse Lance Storm after his bafflingly stupid Canadian rules match. Bret looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world, much like all of us watching. The decision to drop Hart, whose contract at face value was the second highest in the company to Hulk Hogan, comes as no surprise from a business standpoint. The company is running deeply in the red, and there's strong pressure to cut costs. Hall was also reported to have one of the highest price contracts in the company, and given that he had spent more time on the shelf than not lately, and by this time was fit and healthy to work, he could well be let go. You might think that with Hall becoming a free agent, it might seem pretty obvious that he would try to get back into WWE. Him interacting with the likes of The Rock and Triple H in 2000 would have been a must-see, no doubt. But it seems that it was never a possibility. Back in February, Dave Meltzer wrote, "We're told if WCW fires Scott Hall, that WWF wouldn't take him under any circumstances, and they've soured on Kevin Nash as well, as they like the idea of building the company around hungry young wrestlers that aren't as into the political games of holding on to their spot and keeping talent down." This is quite an interesting quote when you consider that not too long after, Hall, Nash and Hogan would be back in the company, so if Hall wasn't going to WWE, where could he go? Rumours of Scott Hall arriving in ECW were actually going around not long before he made his debut, and you could say that they came from a credible source. Most in ECW believe Heyman is interested in using Scott Hall. There is talk that Heyman has asked Hall's longtime friend Justin Credible to send out feelers. Justin's time in WWF as Aldo Manoia would have overlapped with Hall's time as Razor Ramon, and this is thought to be where their friendship stemmed from. Speaking in an interview with Hannibal TV in 2019, Justin actually says they became friends before this though. He tells us that when he first arrived as an enhancement wrestler, even before Aldo Manoia, he was too young to rent a car himself, and so Hall took him under his wing rather than him have to travel with the road agents. Hall had actually attended an ECW show previously as an invited guest of Justin, but was not welcomed by everyone, as Shane Douglas wasn't happy that he was there. But then, to be fair, Shane doesn't seem happy around anyone. By the time the rumours in the Torch had been published, Scott had actually already made his first appearance on November 10th, and would make his second the next night. Afterwards, the Torch noted that it was actually Hall who approached Justin about the possibility of working for ECW, perhaps wanting to show that he'd got himself together and could still go. In a November 2023 interview with Wrestling News Co., Justin confirms that he was the go-between and was looking forward to working with Hall. One thing that nobody seems to agree on, however, is what Hall was paid for his appearances. Justin says that Hall used his air miles to fly to the shows and worked for free, while others claim he worked for next to nothing. If Hall did work for a big payday, nobody wants to admit that. ECW sources also claim that when the issue of money came up, Hall told Heyman, "Treat me like a jabroni." The same sources say Hall's only request was that he was able to work with Credible. Keller also notes that this claim was met with a lot of distrust, and was likely made up by Paul to appease his locker room, who may not understand the idea of paying Hall a lot of money when they are still owed a month's worth of pay. A fair thought to have, given that Hall wasn't exactly known for working for a pittance in WCW. On November 10th in Schenectady, New York, Scott Hall would come out unadvertised and receive a monstrous cheer from the crowd. The footage we have is from an ECW fan cam, so the quality is a little sketchy, but you can still hear the crowd come unglued when he walks through the curtain. And Scott, who hadn't appeared in front of a live crowd in 9 months, revels in it. He would team with Jerry Lynn to face Justin Credible and the television champion, Rhino. Lynn, by the way, is someone very familiar with another of Scott's best friends, Sean Waltman, as the two would work together a lot in their early careers, when Sean was the Lightning Kid. A lot of the early match itself is left to Lynn and Credible, who were both at the time challengers for Steve Corino's world title. And when Hall does get in there, there's a fair bit of time where the fans are allowed to take the moment in. Hall throws his toothpick at Justin and they finally get into it. At one point, Hall even takes the microphone mid-match to give the crowd a "Hey yo." What's most interesting though is when Hall and Rhino are in a sign of things to come when Rhino would get to WWE in 2001. Rhino looks a lot smaller than Hall, unlike when he stands across the ring from a lot of his ECW opponents. But Rhino, who is at this time a main event prospect for Heyman, gets considerable offense in. This is perhaps slightly unfair though, as Scott Hall makes most wrestlers he's in the ring with look smaller. To continue the ongoing storylines, Jerry Lynn would reverse a That's Incredible attempt with a tombstone of his own to win the match and send the crowd home happy. Another notable aspect of the match are some interactions with Francine that you frankly wouldn't have seen had the match happened today. There's actually a bit of history to this, as when Scott was there previously as a guest, Francine, in her own words, was quite defensive due to her alignment with Shane Douglas. Francine says that when they met again in 2000, she apologised and the two made up. In a way.
After Shane curses him out, I say, you want to watch the show, then get in line with the other marks. Now, Shane's not here anymore.
Right.
So I go up to him, and he says, you're that franchise girl, aren't you? And I said, I want to apologize. And I did. I apologized. I said, I stuck up for my friends when in reality, I just should have kept my mouth shut because it wasn't my fight to fight, right? It was Shane's battle. And I knew we were working together that night because, he was working with PJ. And I told him, give me the razor's edge. I'll take it. I deserve it. I should have kept my mouth shut. And he goes, nah, I'm just going to make out with you a little bit. I was like, what? Yeah, he said, and he point blank, I do not want to hurt you. Because he could have just picked me up and threw me as a receipt. Right. Some guys would do that 100%.
The next night in Poughkeepsie, New York, Scott Hall would actually wrestle 2 matches, the first of which is on the surface quite bizarre. To open the show, Hall would interrupt the ring announcer coming out to Ready or Not by the Fugees, and tell the fans that Paul Heyman promised him a match with Just Incredible. This would bring out Paul's non-union equivalent, Louis Dangerously, to tell Hall that in order to have the match he wanted, he would have to face someone of Lou's choosing, and so out would come, of all people, Big Sally Graziano of the Full-Blooded Italians. You might have expected in this situation for Scott to have faced an up-and-coming prospect, of which ECW had a few, but I think it's fair to say that Big Sal wasn't exactly that. Sal was, if I may throw my opinion in, a fantastic outside-the-ring addition to the FBI. At a build size of over 6 feet tall and about 600 pounds, Sal was certainly an imposing presence, especially standing next to Little Guido and the rest of the group. He could interject himself into matches, offering the assist to Guido, or to be a human crash pad for many of his opponents. I don't want you to think that I'm trashing Sal at all, because those are definitely his strengths, but being an in-ring wrestler full-time probably wasn't. The vast majority of his ECW matches were short squashes, where he would lose to Spike Dudley, both to get the crowd going and to get Spike's giant killer persona over with the fans. Later on, he would have more tag team matches with Guido, and would actually wrestle on pay-per-view once, defeating Balls Mahoney at Heatwave 2000 in a very short match. All of this made it all the more shocking that in about 6 minutes, Big Sal would actually pin Scott Hall with a banzai drop. Post-match, Lou tells a prone Hall that he still has his match with Justin later on. According to The Torch, Hall's defenders are claiming that he offered to do the job for Graziano in Poughkeepsie because he's high on the FBI. Meanwhile, Heyman is telling friends that he asked Hall to put over Graziano as a show of respect for the locker room, and that Hall offered no resistance. This match didn't end without some controversy though, as the ending would get botched. Booking plans called for Tony Mamaluke to interfere in the match, after Hall hit his finisher on Little Guido, who was also supposed to interfere in the match. Mamaluke interfered earlier than he was supposed to, and Hall wasn't able to hit his finisher as planned. Once everyone got to the back, Scott apparently berated Mamaluke in front of the other wrestlers for not being able to hit his cues, telling him that he shouldn't be in the business if he can't. According to some, Hall was ribbing him, but Mamaluke didn't see it that way. Aside from the Mamaluke incident, most ECW sources described Hall as being friendly and professional with the other wrestlers, regardless of their position on the card. That word most might be doing a fair bit of heavy lifting there. Despite losing to Big Sal, Scott would get his match with Just Incredible in the main event of the show. In a November 2023 interview with Wrestling News Co., Just Incredible explained that this match had some significant meaning for him, because we used to always do TV tapings for the WWF in Poughkeepsie at the Mid-Hudson Civic Center. A lot of those famous matches happened in that arena.
So I'm like, Scott, you want to come wrestle me at that building we used to love and do TV at? He's like, fuck it. So he booked, a ticket with his frequent flyers, came up, and we worked. We worked in the main event,
Unlike the previous 2 matches, this one was filmed with better quality ECW TV cameras, which indicates that this may well have been supposed to air at some point. For reasons I'll get to later, it never would though. This match feels very much one-sided, with Hall putting Justin through a table, getting a little more revenge on Francine, and Justin even at one point cowers away from Hall, who hits the outsider's edge to get the relatively clean victory in about 9 minutes. Well, clean for ECW. According to the Torch, there were plans in place for Scott Hall to make his next appearance on December 3rd at ECW's next pay-per-view, Massacre on 34th Street. Both sides agreed that if things went well, Hall would appear at the pay-per-view, presumably in a match against Credible. While none of Hall's matches would ever air on ECW television, the company were very keen to let the fans know that more seemed to be coming. On the November 18th Hardcore TV, the next after Hall's appearances, the show starts with a graphic telling us, while Cyrus talks about something else entirely. The same graphic would reappear many times throughout the episode. Later on, Joey Styles and Joel Gertner actually tell us that Scott Hall has arrived in ECW, teasing that fans could get more info at their website. Joel would then tell us that the outsider is now inside ECW, which definitely makes it sound like he might be staying. They also ran a plug for the Hardcore Hotline, where fans were promised the full story on how Scott Hall wound up in ECW. On the following week's episode, Joey Styles would continue to tease more from Scott Hall, this time in the context of his brewing feud with Justin Credible, and he teased shocking news about Hall on their website. On December 2nd, the day before Massacre on 34th Street, in one final tease on ECW TV, and be warned this is a weird one, we cut to Jasmine St. Clair standing in front of a door, teasing that she's about to interview the leader of the Order. I knew where this was going, but I hoped so badly that the Dark Order were behind that door. After a break, Jasmine opens the door to reveal not Scott Hall, but his Blue World Order counterpart. Blue Meanie was behind the door, complete with Razor Ramon impression. We would also get another hotline tease, where Joey Styles tells us quite possibly the reason we don't see Hall again. Scott Hall runs afoul of the law. On November 22nd, Scott was arrested for driving the wrong way down a street in Stanford, Florida, actually causing an accident. Despite this, Wade Keller notes, Heyman has not ruled out the idea of booking him in the future. At press time, sources say it's doubtful Hall will appear at the pay-per-view. A few days later, Scott would be arrested for a second time, this time for an incident involving a taxi. Apparently, Hall had tried to pay for his cab fare with a credit card, but the driver told him he couldn't accept that form of payment. Hall reportedly became upset and kicked the door of the cab, which led to his arrest. On Hardcore TV on December 12th, ECW would air another hotline plug, in which Joey Styles says, "No, this isn't a rehash of an old story. He screwed up again." According to the Torch, Hall still wanted to make it to the pay-per-view, and Paul Heyman would have considered booking him, but his agent advised him not to go. Had Hall made it to Massacre on 34th Street, he was set to interfere in the main event, costing Justin Credible the ECW World title in his match against Jerry Lynn and the champion Steve Corino, and setting up a match between the two at the next pay-per-view, Guilty as Charged in January. Sources close to Heyman don't believe he's ruled out the idea of using Hall in the future, but are unsure as to Hall's status for the next pay-per-view. Wade also noted that Scott had had an offer from New Japan by this point, but that his arrest may have cost him that. Hall would eventually go to Japan, but it would take him till March to get there. Hall would end up spending the next 6 months wrestling in Japan, before eventually making his way back to WWE with the NWO. You might be wondering, as I was, why Hall's appearances never aired on ECW television. We know that Hall was next intended to show up on a pay-per-view, so if Hall's arrests hadn't have happened, it seems like the company were planning on having the fans pay to see Hall for the first time in an ECW ring, inside the already sold out Hammerstein Ballroom. Had everything gone according to plan, this feels like a clever strategy for them to increase their pay-per-view buys and build interest for their next events. But by the time Massacre came along, the decision had been made not to use Hall anymore, and so airing the footage might not have felt necessary. It became, because of this, A bizarre holy shit moment that ECW fans all knew about but never saw on TV. In the 2007 interview with RF Video that I referenced earlier, Scott Hall said that despite all of his out-of-the-ring problems, he believed that he would always be able to find work wherever he wanted it for one simple reason: his work in the ring. Underneath everything I watched for this video, there are tons of comments from fans praising Scott Hall for his mind for wrestling, and to listen to him talk in depth, he clearly has that. He described wrestling as an outlet for him, and notes that when at home with nothing to do, he came to see that as a bad thing, noting that he would always get into trouble. Until he cleaned his lifestyle up in his last few years, he may well have had a point about this, as he always had a way of bouncing back after each pitfall in his career. He was absolutely right in his epic Hall of Fame speech. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.